Hello, I'm Michael Patton on the graduate faculty of the Union Institute, and I'm your host for this videotape on quality in the doctoral program. This videotape series has been sponsored by the Learner Council that is anxious to provide additional materials to you for use in seminars and colloquia, and especially for peer days. So there are some videotapes on research and on research ethics, and this videotape will look particularly at elements of quality in the doctoral program. We'll have several faculty share their views about quality and their experiences with learners, as well as we will share with you some of the work the faculty as a collective has been doing on quality assurance, not just for accreditation, but because of our own commitment to excellence in higher education. Our first faculty member to share with you today is Dr. Ben Davis. Ben has been with the Union a long time. He has been a dean in the Union Institute. He is one of the passionate advocates for the Union approach to education. Ben once noted that he considered Union the most elegant academic program for the experienced adult learner. Ben did his own doctoral work at the University of Chicago in education and has recently been working a great deal in adapting technology and new directions in technology to the humanistic forms of union engagement that represents our approach to this elegant model for the experienced adult learner. Ben has also been one of the real champions of a consistency of attention to quality and chaired the first Quality Assurance Committee at Union, has stayed engaged around quality assurance efforts to make them not just paperwork and accreditation tools, but to make them a meaningful way of engaging faculty and learners in thinking about what constitutes a high-quality doctoral program, both for the Union as a whole and for individual learners. And so when we thought about doing this videotape, it was clear that the first person we wanted to hear from was Ben Davis.
Quality assurance. The first thing to think about on is quality assurance rather than quality control. A big issue in the Union Institute, one that we thought about a long time, and what I hope to say will give you the examples of assurances rather than control over the process. This is a learner-centered process. This is what we believe in, and still we have to have some assurances that the faculty and the learners are doing their jobs in terms of undertaking programs. The Quality Assurance Committee has been around since the early 90s, and I've been very active in both long-term studies. The most recent one ended in 1999. I was the chair of that at the end. We did both a formative and a summative evaluations of everything in the doctoral process. And I want to give you some examples of the extensiveness of the work that we did. We based our last report in 1999 on the following: 210 peer day evaluations, 104 seminar evaluations, over 100 second core reader reports, 79 learning agreements, 65 colloquium evaluations, 15 applications, 15 transcripts, and 60 PDEs and program summaries, and involved, the committee has 9 people on it, including learners and graduates, as you know, but the process of doing quality assessment involved a wide variety of graduate faculty members as we went through the process of looking at everything from matriculation, from the application to graduation. This is the only committee in the Union Institute, graduate faculty part of it, that looks at the entire process. All the other committees in the graduate school are focused on some dimension of the graduate program. Quality assurance from the beginning to the end. These 648 documents that were reviewed in over a 4-year period involved a lot of reading time and a lot of controversy and discussion about what we were finding. And I want to just talk about the two things that I think that we found most important. One is for learners, and one is for faculty. And for the learners, we require you, the learner, to report on each experience that you have in the program, starting with your colloquium evaluation. That's the first one and on through. In looking at all the evaluations, we came to the conclusion that mostly what learners were doing were reporting on their experiences, and the audience of their reports was somebody far removed from themselves. And so we said, that's not the intention. That's not what we want. If we want to report, we can videotape it, and we can see them when it went on in a colloquium or a seminar. So we coined the notion of a learner self-reflective evaluations of all these events. And we're trying to get that notion across not only with learners, but with our faculty members also, who look at the reports that you learners turn in, and we faculty review. And the idea is, who is the audience for the learner report on the events that they participate in? And that means your certification, how it was to do your PDE and whatever. You're the audience. And we can get from your evaluation of that experience how well we did in conveying the core values and processes that we've been working with the last 30 years in the development of this institution. That was one thing, trying to turn the learner evaluations from reports of their experiences to truly self-reflective evaluations about their experience. How did it change the learner who engaged the seminar, or the colloquium, or the peer day, or the certification meeting, or the pre-graduation meeting, or whatever it was? Where was that experience for you, the learner? And in that process, much is said about what the faculty member did or didn't do, and we get our sense of how well we're doing from that. That was one of the major outcomes of the summative evaluation that the Quality Assurance Committee did in their 1999 report for the learners. The second most important outcome was that in looking at all these documents, they ranged from the superb to the unacceptable. And that's a huge range, not unexpected, we found it not unexpectedly, but still troublesome for the faculty. So then the question becomes, with the superb, we're all extremely happy. With the unacceptable, we asked a lot of questions about how could an unacceptable document that was deemed unacceptable by 4 different faculty readers who were not on that learners committee, and the dean's review, and the dean, if they were involved in that decision, how did this individual graduate? And it's not that we had, these were all looked at people who are long gone from the institution. We looked at everyone who had completed their program. Graduation wasn't an issue. But we then began to look at where did the process break down so that a product was developed that didn't meet our expectations, and that's of a number of faculty members, not just the committee involved. So we looked at the committee organization, who was on that doctoral committee, and the relationships between those folks. And we looked at from the application, was the problem of an inadequate PDE and program summary evident at the application stage? Were we onto the problem early enough to make any kind of corrective measures? Because often by the time of the pre-graduation meeting, if the product isn't at a minimally acceptable level, we're in a real bind about what are we going to do about that process. We needed to institute an earlier identification of where the product has the likelihood of not meeting our minimal standards. And the primary role in this total process is the faculty's role. And so the idea was to get the faculty early, to identify early areas where there may be problems with a learner's program, and that could be in committee composition to preparing for the certification around the learning agreement or the final programs. We also found that the adjunct professors, in spite of the way in which we describe their responsibilities as the main folks around field proficiency and the research that the individual engages in, to defer very often to the core faculty member. This is a problem because the core can work with anyone in any field, and so the core may not be knowledgeable in the learner's field, and in those cases we have to rely on an adjunct faculty member who's deferring to the core. We found all these variances in our program, and so the idea around quality assurance was to try to go back to the original committees who worked with those learners to see if the faculty members involved in that learner's program had the same opinion, point of view about the work that was prepared, because it is in the ones that we think are minimal quality or barely acceptable, and in some cases unacceptable to the faculty readers. That means that there's a difference in terms of what we're expecting from our learners. And the major problem of quality assurance is to come up with ways that hold the faculty member accountable in proper relationship to the other members on the committee for the quality of the work produced by the learners. The new review system where faculty do the procedural reviews at the completion of certification and pre-graduation meetings something that I really like, because I think it's another way in which, in quality assurance, we're broadening the base of who's involved in assuring that the quality undertaken in this program by learners and by faculty, because your products reflect on us as well. We're a participant in the process. We're equal on that committee. All of us are equal, as we must be unanimous in our agreement. So we know that the peers and the adjuncts and the core share this responsibility for products that don't come up to snuff. And we have this difficulty on the faculty about how much is enough, because there is the issue of we take folks in, obviously, and they make tremendous progress in terms of where they started this program from matriculation to graduation, and then there are folks that believe that there is a minimum standard that must be maintained, however one gets there to receive the PhD degree. And as a faculty, we're not uniform at all in agreement about that particular issue. Progress in the program as against meeting a minimum standard. That's something that quality assurance has to address later on. We also wondered about how to solve difficulties on committees. We noticed that in the committee, we went back to the PDEs again that we thought were not quite up to snuff and looked at interesting things like how many committee changes were made on those committees? How many changes of core took place? How many changes of adjunct professors took place? And we found that where there's a lot of variation and switching of folks, it's very hard to keep the process in place for the new members that join. And how are they oriented to their role if someone joins a doctoral committee after certification? And whether that be a core faculty member or an adjunct or a replaced peer. And the other thing we found was that how do we make sure that if we grant peers and graduates equality in terms of unanimity of the committee around quality assurance, how can they play an active role in the development and assessment of the program? And that was another issue that we took to the Learner Council in terms of trying to make the point that the peers and graduates have to play an active part as a full participating member. Too often the faculty report that they go to certifications or pre-graduations, and the peers see their role as mainly supportive, and they don't say anything, I suppose, is the greatest support you can get in one of those meetings, or only very positive comments. And so the idea is, this is a beautiful system where the peers have an equal part to the faculty role. There are certain responsibilities that have to be exercised by the peers, just like the adjunct faculty, who are appointed to this faculty for the period that they serve on your doctoral committee. So they're just as important as the core faculty are, but quality assurance rests with the faculty. And it's the hope I think, of the Quality Assurance Committee, that we can improve our processes to the point where we don't have a significant number of products that meet minimal standards. That we'll always have some, because this is true in any institution. Folks have varying ideas about what minimum standard amounts to. But there needs to be more unanimity among the learners and the faculty about the nature of the process and what's going to be expected for the completed work that learners engage and produce.
One of the reasons we wanted to bring this tape to you is to have you think together, in whatever setting you're in, about issues of quality, and to let you know how the faculty have been working on issues of quality throughout the history of the Union Institute. You heard from Ben Davis about the effort in the Quality Assurance Committee to look at the documents that we do and think about and talk about how we can improve that process. And we wanted you to know that we share that commitment in the work that we do together. Because Union is not well known by people, issues of quality come up all the time. And we want you to know and have a factual basis for communicating to others that this is a program dedicated to excellence and to high quality, and that we work together on that regularly at faculty meetings. In addition to the Quality Assurance Committee, we have other ways of engaging this issue. During the recent transition in the presidency, a series of retreats were held among the faculty looking at future directions of the Union Institute. And at one of those retreats, there was significant attention given to the issue of enhancing the quality of the doctoral program generally and enhancing the quality of individual doctoral programs. One of the participants in that retreat and in that group on quality is going to share with you some of what that group talked about. The presenter on that is Dr. Mary Sheeran. Mary's degree is from the University of Massachusetts, where she did her doctoral work in child and human development. Mary's a longtime faculty member and has regularly engaged with others around issues of critical thinking. She has helped draft the positions for the faculty on interdisciplinarity. She has been an advocate for quality thinking reflected in quality writing. And so she has a long history engaged with this issue of what constitutes quality work in the doctoral program. So Mary Sheeran will share with you both her individual views and the work of the Retreat Committee on Quality.
Well, I was part of a self-identified group that discussed quality assurance and in the graduate school. When we convened, we focused almost immediately on what is the nature of graduate level work. How do we recognize it? What constitutes graduate level work, graduate level thinking, graduate level products? And that became the point of the discussion. I would say, for me, and I'm only speaking for myself here, though I think my sentiments were echoed by a good number in the group, is that the kinds of knowledge that we expect of learners are, I think, very congruent with the principles of the Union Institute. For instance, that that knowledge, graduate level knowledge for us, is active, that learners are not simply sponges that collect information and can spout that information back, but rather that it's an active process of engaging in dialogue with the wisdom of the fields in which they're engaging. By the wisdom of the fields, I guess I do mean the historically important generative texts and authors of that field, that they are conversant with current issues and theories that define the areas that they are studying. And in our case, because our learners are working in interdisciplinary ways, it becomes much more complex than it is for traditional institutions and conventional departments in colleges. So how does that happen? How does that happen for us? And I think in the case of many learners, certainly not all, their programs revolve around problematics rather than covering areas in a field. Since our learners are exclusively adults, many of them with many years of experience in their fields, and coming from already many, not all, coming from being actively engaged with the thinking of the field in critical ways, it's easier to develop programs around problematics in which they range across disciplines, bringing to bear on their subject matter texts and authors and ideas from anywhere that pertain. So I guess the first characteristic that I'm talking about is, or thinking about, is that learners are active learners. They're actively engaged in their fields. They are contemporary. They're aware not only of historical texts, which are important, the historical, the generative texts in their fields. And as an aside, texts don't have to all be in print. Texts can come in all different forms. They can be visual, audio, kinesthetic, but the important texts in the field. And that they locate themselves in relation to those texts. So they take positions, they have a stance, and that stance is displayed for us, for the doctoral committee, for the academic world, as being informed by an awareness of what the contestations, what are the contentions within the field, what are the issues that are being discussed and that are contested, and where do they locate themselves in those issues, in regard to those issues. So that learning is active. I think also for us, the learning is grounded in a continuous awareness of the world around them, that it isn't theory for theory's sake or writing a dissertation to sit on a shelf in a library, but rather that lively, active, engaged knowledge leads to change in the world, has an impact in the world, and an impact on themselves, the authors of that knowledge. So it's, I would say, I keep going back to the word active. It's always and ever, I would say, an active process and an engaged process. It's not passive, it's not totally receptive, but there's receptivity, but also activity. Ideally, they shape the knowledge so that the information, I shouldn't say the knowledge, they shape the information that they receive so that they create their own spin on it. And that's where I imagine originality coming in, that when they have completed their program, the discourse in their interpretive communities has shifted somewhat. There's a new point of view. There's a fresh perspective. There is something new added beyond the way the discourse had already been, the way the conversation had been going. There's a new entry into it. And for me, for learners, one of the goals of their programs, one of the goals that I urge upon them, learners who often don't think of themselves coming to Union to become scholars, but that nonetheless, that one of the wonderful outcomes of the program is that they become engaged in that community of discourse, that they become engaged in a conversation of what's going on in their field, of those contestations, of the problems, of their points of view, of the way they see what they've learned impacting on the world, and that becomes part of the ongoing conversation. So they're no longer, if they ever were, uninformed outsiders listening to a conversation and kind of taking it in and absorbing it, but rather they enter into the circle and become active participants and therefore contributors to that conversation, and thereby, again, changing the conversation, altering it.
You've been reviewing some of the dean's review documents. What kind of things, what kind of problems are you seeing in quality? Talk about the other side. You talked about what quality is. talk about what quality isn't. Sometimes we recognize something by what it isn't.
Okay.
So what are you seeing that concerns you?
Well, I started off by lauding activity, learners being active learners. And what I see in a significant number of the learning agreements and the program summaries and the PDEs, but to a bit of a lesser extent there, is that reports on peer days, reports on learning events, forgetting the residency alone, but reports on learning events, that learners have gone to conferences, that they have engaged in independent study and that sort of work, that it seems to come out as sometimes as an iteration of what they've read. So I read this book and I read this author, and this author says this, and this text says that, and someone else says something else, and the learner seems absent. I mean, what does I always say to myself, well, so what does the learner have to say about all that? Where do they come in? So I think a kind of receptivity, that they aren't active, they aren't always reflective. These are the problems. This isn't talking about everybody. But that there's no sense of an evaluative or a reflective stance, that this makes sense, or intertexting, what literary theorists call intertexting, which is a learner that reads 7 or 8 books in a field, and then not intertexting is that they report on each one separately. Intertexting is that they bring the authors, the ideas, the information, the proposals in the text together and engage them, bring them into dialogue with one another, and that in that process the learner herself or himself takes a position within that articulation, within that conversation. That's sometimes is missing, that reflective, synthetic process. It's in a way reporting on what there is rather than reflecting on it or critiquing it or synthesizing it, and most important for me, locating herself, however tentatively, within that discourse, taking a position. On the matter of quality of voice, or the presence of voice, where it works, where the learner's voice is present, I think, first of all, it's very hard for a learner to be present when they continuously use the third person or act as, or speak on paper as if it's a detached entity constructing this text, that it has somehow nothing to do with herself or himself. So that, I think, is kind of at the extreme edge of it. But when a learner is in a way present, voice is actively making meaning of the text, then the reader is engaged. You want to read and know what's going on, and there's a sense of activity and liveliness. It's an enlivened text. Where the learner is absent, it becomes reiterative. It's boring. It's tedious. It's dull. It's without voice. It has voice, but the voice is neutral and unengaging. The other side of that, of course, is where the only voice that there is the voice of the learner. There's no discourse community. It's solipsistic. It's self-referential. That all you hear about is, this is my experience, and anathema to any kind of authentic scholarship, that because this is my experience, this is the way it is in the world. Or because this is the experience of 5 or 6 or 7 people, this is how this event is experienced. This is the meaning that people make of this experience. So where the learner doesn't embed herself or himself in the discourse of the community, and that's where the historical, generative, critical contemporary texts are really important. If they're not part of the discourse of the learner, then you can lose sight of the larger picture, and you focus only on the narrow experience that you're describing, and sometimes narrower yet only on yourself, that your own sense of how the world is or should be. So another aspect of all of the quality of our work, and this is particularly true, and it's explicitly true in the union community. I think it's becoming necessarily true in other more traditional settings. But when I speak about having different perspectives and different points of view, it's not simply different theoretical, purely academic points of view, but that learners reach out beyond the confines of what is the conventionally defined experts in the community, experts in the field. Those experts are very often persons of middle class, upper class. They're usually white. They're often male, though not always now. The voices of persons of color, of persons of working class people, of persons whose experiences are widely divergent from the communities that have created the canons of their field, I would say are really important for our learners to discover, because often you have to discover them. You have to search for them and discover those voices and bring those voices into the discourse that's going on in your head, as well as the larger community into which you enter. And for me, it's one very important genre, which is often neglected in this process, is to look to imaginative writing, imagined writing, to literature, to the use of fiction. Fiction particularizes experience in ways that texts of sociology and history might not do. I think, for instance, immediately of Toni Morrison's Beloved, which particularizes, brings to one particular family the extreme horrors of slavery in ways that I can't imagine that any text of history or sociology or any of the focused texts on the study of slavery have done or do. The use of films, the use of poetry, of memoir, these all particularize history and enable a scholar, a learner, to hear other voices outside the voices of the traditional text, which often are distant, generic, and come from a very narrow range of discourse that is often quite detached from the experience of persons who have gone through, who have lived through particular phenomena, like the phenomenon of slavery, the phenomenon of being a native person in America, of living in urban blight, and you could go on and on, of being a working class mother, so on.
We've heard from Ben Davis about the faculty's ongoing attention to quality assurance, and from Mary Sheeran, both about the retreat experience that she had discussing quality and her own perspective emphasizing engagement and being active in a scholarly dialogue from perspectives, a history from different points of view. One of the central parts of the PDE experience is engaging in some form of research. And we're going to have a discussion about how that fits into the quality program, as well as how the social action projects and unions' commitment to social justice has scholarly dimensions to it. And to engage in that discussion, the two faculty are joining me. Alan Barstow is one of the faculty who works in organizational development. He has a doctorate in anthropology from Columbia, has worked extensively in both private sector and not-for-profit organizations, does a lot of work with the faculty around our own governance system, and has extensive fieldwork experience. And I'm going to ask Alan here in a moment to talk some about high-quality fieldwork from his experience, including the ethical dimensions of fieldwork. My good friend Nancy Boxill is a union graduate, and so she has been through this from the inside, as you all are now engaged in it. Her doctorate was in child development. Is that right, Nancy? Child development here at Union. And she brings to this not only scholarship, having worked and written a book, edited a book about homelessness and homeless families, but she is also has been engaged with the Center for Humanistic Studies on humanistic psychology, and is an elected official in the county of Fulton County, has been an elected official for a number of years, and is especially able to help us think about the connection between Union's commitments to social action, social justice, social meanings, and scholarship, what constitutes high-quality engagement around those issues. So I'm going to invite each one to share their individual thoughts about these issues first, and then we'll talk with each other about it. So Alan, let me start with you. Talk some about high-quality field work, the ethics and integrity that undergirds that, anything that sparks from you.
When I begin to think about that, I begin to think how often as we report our research, we fall into, this is what I planned to do, or this was my plan, and this is what I did. And there's a very clear distinction between the plan and the implementation or the doing. And even the union process is divided that way, with a learning agreement and a contract, and then the dissertation or the PDE. But in fact, in reality, I don't think it's not the planning and the doing and that checkpoint that's really the source of the quality in a program. I think it's much more of a design process that is an iterative process of having an idea, communicating it to others, your committee members, your advisors, and others, and then also testing it out and doing it. So I think a quality program has much more of an ongoing iterative design process to realize a quality result. We structure the program, and there are important checkpoints, but it's not about inspecting quality into the documents, the learning agreement, and the PDE. It's much more about staying in conversation throughout the process with different constituencies and different stakeholders to make sure that those perspectives are present and that they're revisited, that your results and what you're learning as you're doing through the process is incorporated into your design. Now, obviously that's an explicit aspect of action research that you're doing that, and not everyone's doing an action research methodology. But I think this aspect of thinking about open conversations, continuing conversations with your subjects, with the sponsors of your research, certainly with your committee, with all aspects of the stakeholders in your doctoral program, is where the quality comes from. And it's a very important element to make sure it's not done first and it's not done at the end, it's done throughout.
Are there, in that openness and that dialogue, talk some about your experience of ethical challenges in being open, because part of the tension for learners is getting it done, getting an informed consent, getting people to sign off on it, getting through, stop paying tuition. And you're suggesting a deep sense of reflection that has to do with some other outcomes here. Talk about balancing that tension, including the ethical dimensions that you encounter and recommend. Maybe share experience around
Yeah,
that.
let me give you some of my experience, because I was doing research in a corporate setting of Volvo Corporation. And one of the things that's important to say about ethics, it's not just assuring anonymity. It's in fact making sure you have an informed and explicit understanding about the research and its context. In this particular case, Volvo wanted to be recognized. They were engaged in some social change activities in terms of work floor organization. I proposed to come in because I had certain theoretical and conceptual frameworks that I thought could help them do that, and I had to negotiate that. they were doing that work. It wasn't my project. Could I do my experiment? Could I do my project in your organization? They were engaged in trying to change relationships within the factory. So my challenge was to talk with them about that. I would get my dissertation out of that, and I would write that up, but I would also bring to that better ways to engage workers and managers in those conversations, and so that they had a benefit, that they had something to gain from that as well. So that was an important aspect, I think, of that research. Now, when I got access to Volvo, the management said, oh, yeah, we'd be interested in that. But, you know, we've got to have, make sure that it's understood and that you're credible and that we know that your ideas are thought well of in terms of the concepts you're bringing. So it would be helpful if you had funding from outside. And I had gone to Fulbright and other social science research council and said, I've got this project I'd like to do. I'd like to do it. What do you think? And they said, oh, that's a great project, but you'll never get access to a company that'll let you in to do that. And in fact, it took me an extra year to negotiate with the site and with the funders to say, everyone agrees here that this is valuable work to do and that we can proceed. Because the sponsor or the site, the company, wanted the outside funding as credibility check, and the funders didn't think I'd be able to get the access. And so it took an extra year to get them together before I could do that research. And not alone there. I would have never succeeded in doing my research project if I hadn't consulted with the union to do that work. So there was a stakeholder there that ultimately, to do the work was important.
You mean the labor union?
The labor union, excuse me, yes, the labor union. And that it was important for me not to overlook that, because these kinds of change projects in those settings were collaborative projects between management and union. And in fact, in the course of the research, I had to take on both management and union at times to say, well, if this is about worker participation, it's not just what management thinks workers want, and it's not just what union representation thinks workers want. We have to go ask what workers want. We have to build on that. So it took extra time to get this done, but on the other hand, the quality of the research was immensely more, well, it was just much greater in terms of the applicability of that work to others, what others could read into that work and what others could get out of that work by having all of those bases touched.
And the credibility to all the parties.
And the credibility to all the parties. We came out of that with work that everyone felt had benefit. I certainly got my dissertation out of it. But I think we were able to set up programs that were much more direct, and more of these open conversations, in fact, were happening between workers and managers and workers and union representatives about the topic of interest, and that was how to make these jobs more rewarding, how to make the production of higher quality, how to not just guarantee a higher standard of living, but a better quality of life for everybody engaged in that production process.
Nancy, Alan's reminding me of one of my favorite stories about you, which involved your directing the homeless shelters for families and having large numbers of researchers who saw an easy population to come in and administer instruments to and things. So you were on the other side of that, not as a researcher, but responding to requests to what appeared to them to be an easy and captive population. Tell about how you handled that and the issues that come up about dealing with vulnerable populations, the way that we approach them as research subjects, any of that, and your own sense of values around that.
In the particular instance that you're citing at the homeless shelter, I would make requests of the researchers to tell me very clearly what it was they had to offer us. We had some data that they wanted, and I needed then to know what they could provide these people who had no homes, no clothes, and no food. And for the most part, the researchers were pretty dumbfounded.
That's the very idea.
The very idea that I would even ask something of them, as opposed to be honored that they were asking to take something that I had. But we worked it out. We learned from each other. I learned how to speak to them more clearly, and they learned that they did have some responsibility to make a connection with the subjects. And so sometimes, I mean, the things that we asked of them was, take all the children out for an ice cream sundae. Bring some Pampers with you. How about a crate of oranges? So it wasn't dollars that we needed, but what I really wanted the researcher to understand was that there really was a human connection between themselves and what it was they proposed to do. And for me, Michael, I find myself asking learners in the union particularly, because that's the group that is most interested in social action kinds of projects, who wants you to do this? What makes it a good idea? Who said this should change? Why should we have a new approach to substance abuse? And if we should have a new substance abuse treatment program, why should it be yours? Not that, I'd never mean those questions to divert learners from their path. I always mean them as come-ons, so that the learners can become stronger and clearer about just what it is they have to offer, while recognizing that the community in which they live is no grand experiment. It's a neighborhood. And there needs to be, and to attempt to influence the neighborhood, in my mind, means that one has to speak with one's neighbors. It's a little strange to have your neighbor pass out a flyer announcing that the neighborhood shall now be different because I say so. I had a dream last night about the neighborhood being different.
Talk about how you think about this relationship between, not just in social action projects, although that's where it comes up perhaps most, and you've worked with people doing creative projects as well, and the notion of scholarship. I mean, ultimately the doctorate is a scholarly degree. You've come through that in Union yourself. And for much of the external world, one of the things that calls our scholarly quality into question is commitments to social action, to social justice, social meanings. How do you think about those things going together? Social action, scholarship.
For me, Michael, what's very important for the learner to ask themselves is, will my energy, i.e. my work, make a contribution to my field and to my community? And I think the way that I'm most familiar with trying to arrive at an answer to that question is to be convinced, and for the learner to be convinced, that they know enough about the field to know that they're making a contribution. I mean, I see it a lot in the application essay. I want to come into the union and design a new treatment approach for men who are violent against their spouses. And I have a new idea that's called the ZIP method. And the ZIP method has been around for 40 years. And so what the learner hasn't figured out, and I wouldn't expect this necessarily at the beginning, is that there are people doing that work already. So the process of this doctoral program, as I see it, is for the learner to join the people who are already doing the work. And the way to hold hands with or join in with the people who are doing the work is to know enough about what work is actually going on. And if you know enough about that, then I think you can craft, as a learner, craft a contribution, a real contribution, not one that just says, I read 46 articles and my take on it is just a little different. Because I often say to learners, I cite the Kenneth Clark Doll study. I mean,
Tell people about that, because not everybody may know about that, and that is one of the
You're
classics.
kidding.
Well, there may be one or two people out there, since you're telling about the field.
Okay, right, since I'm telling about the field. I mean, it's the classic study that the psychologist Kenneth Clark did around school desegregation and asking black children in the rural South to make choices around black dolls and white dolls related to self-concept. A critical study, been around for 50 years, 40 years. So it is possible, I say to learners, to redo that study in a new time and place and make a contribution to the field. You don't have to come up with something that nobody else has ever thought of before except you earlier today. You can actually go back and look at something that's very old.
And much of science is, in fact,
Yeah.
finding out how the context may affect what those findings were.
Exactly, exactly. And I think all of that is a part of social action. Understanding enough about the conversation to really have a part in it.
Some of this comes up in your work really as well, Alan. Action research has a tension between the action side, the change side, and the scholarly side. So how do you encounter?
Well, I can think of a number of projects that people have entered into with all the good intent. But what makes it a quality program isn't their intentions are honorable, but in fact that they have are able to make informed decisions and choices. If they're going to contribute to the literature, they have to know what that literature is. If they're going to contribute to the life in a community, they have to know that community in some ways. And the assumptions we make about that are not good enough. You need to test those. You need to communicate those to others in a dialogue, what I call productive conversations, and then you need to begin to do that work as well and learn as you're going. The aspect of recently had a student at a traditional university who did a paper for me on a change project. Their declaration of their project was they wanted to solve homelessness. And we talked all about what does solving mean? And of course, this person had a vision, an image of urban people moving to suburban or ex-urban farmland that's being bought up and turned into developments. This way, we could have these people could live on farms and do farming, and preserve this space.
And get out of our way.
And get out of it, and everybody began to say, okay, this person is intent on helping homeless people, but there's a lot else going on here, and there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of judgments about that need to be assessed and questioned. And if this person just contemplates and analyzes their own approach in isolation without entering into conversation and getting that feedback, they're not going to be proceeding in a way that's of interest or effectiveness for the homeless people or the land. It's trying to save green space in these ex-urban areas. None of it's going to work.
It also seems to me that that's a good example of not knowing the literature, because that's a student who really hadn't been tracking the conversations around this issue of homelessness.
But let's not lose sight of the fact that this person had a passion for something that they wanted to help, and that rather naive approach at first. And it's our job, and I think it's the job of committees and peers and others in the union process to help channel that interest into these informed decisions and choices, because clearly that person was not starting there, and yet there was a passion there to do something, and it's not clear where that work will end up. It might change considerably and say, oh, well, I was very naive and I can't do that and it won't work. But maybe there will be something in there that grows out of that learning process that is a viable, interesting project that has utility and usefulness and impact.
One of the tensions I hear around this is because we encourage people to follow their bliss and follow their passion, and we honor that passion, is the kind of rigor that you're both talking about, rigor of thinking, rigor of analysis, knowing what the scene is. Some of our learners who are very passionate seem to think that bringing rigor to that will undercut the passion, that they just want to go out and do their thing.
Right.
And being asked to carefully examine it, look at assumptions, look at critical thinking, take into account other perspectives, keeps them from getting on with doing their thing. And therefore they don't they don't view the scholarship as helpful to getting something done, but in fact an impediment to it. And I hear both of you saying they really have to be interconnected. It's not, scholarship isn't defined as it was traditionally when I was going through as the stuff that's dry, uninteresting, doesn't have any passion, isn't trying to change. We've almost, in some cases, taken to the other extreme. It's only good if it's passionate and active, and the rigor piece is what sometimes gets called into question.
Well, you know, it seems to me the only reason that we not emphasize, but our intent on the scholarship portion is because the learner said they wanted a PhD.
Yep.
If they wanted to do social work or community organization, that's an MSW, or that's a degree in community org.
I think there's a really important part here too, is that, and I deal with it not so much in social action projects in open public settings, but in corporate organizational settings, is this question of proprietary aspect of the work. And I think you have to go in as a researcher doing a PhD that this is a public document, and that yes, there will be things in here that you can benefit from, but there has to be this contribution to others, a unique contribution to the literature and the knowledge in the field. And you don't have to do that by giving away company secrets or things like that, but that there is a public component to the work that is meant to be shared, and that's an essential aspect of scholarship.
Another area of tension between getting on with things, and people are paying tuition and wanting to get out, and we're sympathetic to that, and preserving quality and attending to quality, which a lot of times the learner seems to feel like it's slowing things down, comes at those two critical junctions, the certification meeting and the pre-graduation meeting. I know a lot of my learners define the high-quality meeting as the one where the signatures get on the document as quickly as possible and where no questions get raised, either about the learning agreement or the PDE at the end. It's a meeting that everything is cut and dried, and there are no surprises, and not very much engagement. And we discuss as a faculty often, in fact, we've been discussing at this very faculty meeting, when these meetings ought to occur, how to bring quality to them, how to make them something that's engaged, but also to make sure that they get the task done. So it's one of those points of tension in our program that kind of highlights the finding some balance between progress and movement and getting the degree and bringing rigor and quality to it. So let me ask you each to reflect on what's a high-quality meeting as a part of a high-quality doctoral program. Nancy?
The high-quality meeting for me is one in which everyone comes there understanding or believing that we're there for conversation. And I really encourage my learners to think of it in that way. We certainly are there to get approval, but for me, if we can shift our thinking and not think so much in terms of getting approval on documents as getting approvals born of conversation, then we've had a good meeting. The documents will get approved. They're simply a recording of the conversations. It's the conversations that generate the heat and the excitement. And so that's what I think a quality meeting is, and that's real hard for learners to step away from.
Conversations sound dangerous sometimes.
Yeah, doesn't sound like they have an end. And the end is the recording of the conversation. And that's the magic of the union process for me.
Helen?
Yeah, I pick up on the word engagement, and if you want to assess the quality of your meeting, assess how engaged people, peers, adjuncts, core, and how engaged people are with the second reader report on substantive issues. Up till those meetings, certification or pre-graduation, the learner is working with, often individually, with an adjunct, with a peer, with the core. And of course, with technology, we can email and have conversations and chat rooms about documents. But until you come face to face in those meetings, I mean, those are really wonderful opportunities. That's why I continue to teach in the union, because that's a real opportunity for people who are interested. There's been something put on the table by the learner for everyone to engage in and exchange and begin to think aloud. And the way that ideas aren't Do you like this? Yes, no, but what does that trigger? If this idea triggers a thought in Michael's head, and then that triggers something in Nancy's head, then ultimately we get to some outcome and some interaction, some dynamic, where something quite innovative and something quite creative can result that is never going to result by all the one-on-one checkpoints and one-on-one conversations we have. So that is, I think, the magic of what can happen, and the idea the learner should think not of, did I get the signatures on the paper quickly and in how much time and quality based on that, but it should be measured more on their job is to bring something to put in front of us that stimulates the conversation and the thinking aloud and the just the interactive discourse about the potentiality and the opportunity that's here. And that can get very exciting. And meetings that sometimes people are rushing to catch their plane or train because they've been so engaged, those are the quality meetings. And that maybe, I understand the discomfort, as I myself would have about a meeting and these people maybe meeting face to face for the first time, or everybody in the room. And that's normal and that's to be expected. But the fact that there's a real opportunity to engage people and to assess the quality of that meeting based on how engaged the ideas were and how people's ideas changed as a result, the learners as well as others, is where I think the value of those meetings comes in.
I say to learners often that the documents are going to get approved. That's going to happen. I mean, it's going to happen. So then the question, and even though each committee member said to you they like the work you've done, you'll know that before the meeting, you'll know that you've had a good meeting when people get there and have new ideas. And they hear one person say something that triggers something else, that triggers something else. Then you're having an academic discussion as opposed to a meeting where we're just looking for pens.
You're going to have trouble shutting us up now, because that reminds me that it continues with the response to the second reader.
Mm-hmm.
And
Sure.
that is a documented example of scholarly discourse, of academic
Sure.
conversation about these ideas. And yes, I like this idea. No, I'm going to defend against that input. But that's the continued dialogue. And ultimately, if you want to measure your quality, the quality of your meeting, it should be also evident in the response to second reader report.
So a good second reader report isn't just one that says everything is wonderful. It's one that invites and contributes to the conversation, and questions some things and takes it to a deeper level.
Right.
I want to do one closing piece with both of you because it's an unusual opportunity for learners to hear a piece of the bridging between our union worlds and the external world. Both Alan and Nancy have very active and visible lives outside of union. Alan teaches at the Wharton School, one of the most prestigious management and business schools at the University of Pennsylvania, and you heard works with national, multinational corporations where matters of prestige are important. Nancy's very, very visible in the Atlanta community as an elected public official at county board meetings and the newspaper. And one of the things learners worry about, of course, is how union's quality is perceived. So let me ask each of you as a way of closing off our discussion. Among those peers that you have at Wharton, in the corporate world, among your political people for whom prestige is important, obviously neither of you would associate with something that was of poor quality. How do you talk about quality in that larger visible world of people who don't know what this is and may think it's just some diploma mill? What do you say? How do you communicate to folks about quality?
Well, one of the first things that always happens in my conversations on that topic, I think that the union learner has more work to do than the student who takes a traditional doctoral program. Because not only do you have to do the work, you have to design what work needs to be done. And I encourage people to look for the best adjuncts and peers, adjuncts in particular they can get, because more than where you go to school, who you work with is extremely important. So you should shoot for the stars in your field, and you should shoot for people who are well known and respected in the field. And even if you can't get them as an adjunct, you might get them as a consultant. But the point is, you need to engage in these conversations with people who are not known in the field. And Union offers you the opportunity to get adjuncts from all over the world and anyone, anywhere that might have that. So I think that's an important aspect of that. Some of the best work I've seen done has been done in the Union PhD program. I've seen traditional or students in traditional universities scramble and get work done, but against a lot of bureaucratic obstacles to bring in different disciplines, different expertise, fields of competence on their committee members. Sometimes there's a limit to how many faculty you can have outside of the school, not outside of the university, but outside of the school within the university. And getting people from engineering and from business and from arts and science can be very difficult to do. We don't have that kind of bureaucratic obstacle at the Union Institute. So I mean, I think that's a real asset for people to take advantage of. But the work, ultimately, there's always a range of students and work at a traditional university or a non-traditional university like Union Institute. And I think ultimately, the learners who spend the time designing the best programs, making themselves work hard as opposed to work to minimum standards, achieve incredible results, and that's well respected. And I've seen that in terms of the many students I've worked at in both traditional and the non-traditional environment.
You know, Michael, I've had the experience as a learner myself and now as faculty, from the learner perspective and from the faculty perspective. As I talk with people about the Union, what is the Union Institute? And I'll say it's an opportunity for adult learners to earn PhDs through a distance learning program. If the person glazes over at all in their eyes, I don't even go on, because they're really not interested. And so I need to hear from the listener or discern from the listener that they really want to know about the institution. Otherwise, I'm treading water to make it sound like it's something exciting you should be interested in.
So you collect some data.
Collect some data quickly. I don't have the opportunity to validate it, but it is collected. So once I get that sense that they'd like to know more, then I start to describe the program, and people are absolutely fascinated. But I'll tell you what is even the most exciting data to collect is the data that's collected from all the work that all the Union learners do. Once people have encountered Union learners who are in the process of executing their program, then they are in touch with quality.
Nicely put. Great way to end. Thank you both. This next segment involves two more of our experienced faculty considering the question of quality. We just heard from Nancy Boxhill and Al Barstow, and now we're going to hear from Jean Griffin and Peter Finner. Jean did her doctoral work at Temple University in educational psychology. Was a faculty member for a number of years at the University of Massachusetts, was a Fulbright Fellow in Barbados, and has worked extensively in doing research in education and published on issues of women and race. Peter has a doctorate in geochemistry from the University of Illinois and is working extensively on science and futuristics in his current work. Peter's also been a long-time faculty liaison to the Learner Council and has worked with the Learner Council over the years, so it's especially appropriate that he be a part of this Learner Council-sponsored activity. Jean and Peter, what we've been talking about with each other and for the benefit of the learners is how we as faculty think about this issue of quality. At this very faculty meeting, we've been talking about what constitutes a quality program and how we support a quality program. So this is an opportunity for us to talk with each other and to the learner community about our various perspectives on that. So Jean, let me start with you. When you talk to learners and to people outside Union about our scholarship about what constitutes quality. You've had years at another university. What's your perspective on union and quality work?
I think the union learners do excellent work for the most part. But of course, like other universities, we have the extremes. We have a few brilliant Yale, Harvard quality, of which we're almost near. And then we have some that are meeting minimal standards. The most part, our learners are at the upper end. And we do call them learners as a way to incorporate that there's always a learning process going on, and to sort of raise the status. At many places, faculty has a status here and learners are thought of as lower. As co-learners, as faculty and what would formerly be known as students, we're all sort of on the same plane, and the teaching learning process goes in both directions, and I learn as much from my learners here as they do from us. For quality, I talk to my learners about having a firm grasp of their discipline. And not only that, to be able to integrate their discipline with others that support it. So we're talking about interdisciplinarity here, which is one of the foundations of a union program. This means having a grasp of the current literature, of the classics in their field, and being able to apply that. So I also work with people around not only knowing the theory, but being able to practice and go back and forth about how does the theory support the practice, and what in your practice is grounded in the theory. So those are like the two.
That's not just rhetoric
things
for you. I mean,
Oh,
you really
absolutely
look
not.
for a real engagement there. So
And-
just use the word theory in a paragraph and then use the word practice
No.
in the next paragraph.
No, in another life and oftentimes in this life, okay, so you're doing this internship, but how does that relate to your readings in a particular area in a field? What does this mean, and what did you get from the from your literature that supports you having an internship and practicing in this matter, and what can you take back to the theory? Do you have perhaps a very different population that this theory didn't work in? Is this something you have to think about again? Was this the wrong theory for this particular group? And how do you begin to make sense of this? So oftentimes on a learner's paper, I'll write, so what? And I tell them that my so what's mean, so what does this mean to you, to your practice, to your program, to your practice? Or what does this, so what does this practice mean to your theory? And after a while, it's not a cynical so what. It's, so what does this really mean to you and your program,
You're
et
inviting
cetera?
some deeper reflection.
Yes,
in that.
yes, yes.
I see as second core a lot of internship descriptions that are just, I did this and I did this and then I did that. And I'm hearing from you that a high-quality internship, as an example, would be one that connected that experiential piece to some thinking, to some analysis,
Absolutely,
to some theory.
absolutely.
Peter, you bring a hard science perspective and background to this humanistic union process. How do you make sense of quality from your perspective?
Well, let me answer that in a bunch of different ways. First, let me take a little bit of exception with Jean's comment at one point. Jean, you said, well, we're almost at Harvard, Yale. Let me say differently. I think our best learners are absolutely equal
Okay.
at that level. And it's harder for learners at the other end to survive. It's difficult to be part of a program where you can't pull someone else's files out of the fraternity files, as it were, or sorority files. And that leads me to what the institution is all about around quality. PhD program is a research program, and it's real important to frame in that direction or in that dimension what one is doing within this institution. And research is all about two things. It's based on what you were talking about, Gina. We'll come back in that way. Knowing what is the literature of the field or the many fields that come together. And in some ways, the program has two components. One is what it does for you as a learner, and that's the part that many folks want to focus on. You asked about what some of the difficulties are, Michael. And many folks believe coming into the program, I want to learn stuff, that's where I want to end up. And that's really the beginning. That's the launching pad. You as a learner have got to know what everyone else in the field is expected to know. And ultimately your goal should be joining an invisible college of some kind. These are the folks collectively who represent the knowledge, throw quotes around that, of a field, or where fields come together, more than one invisible college. One is never invited to join that. There is no faculty hiring committee for that invisible college. From that point, then is the rest of our program, to answer your question of where the quality is, and that is, what is your contribution to the field? And our importance around the notion of social meaning coming from hard science is sometimes a little bit hard for a hard scientist or someone coming from business or health to understand, and that is, what's the larger meaning? How does this fit with the larger corpus out there, with society as a whole? What are we doing to improve things? Well, the two pieces of that, on the hard science side, or generally speaking, we are looking to add to the scholarly literature. Above all, that research piece has got to meet the minimum requirements of what we, larger we, expect from a PhD program. Once that piece is put, once one sees that as the limits of the program, the rest is, the sky is the limit. And that social meaning piece is dropped on top of that, the interdisciplinary aspects that Jean mentioned, the multicultural things, are important to hold up in front of us, particularly on the science side. We see a problem, we want to solve the problem. And it goes beyond that. That comes to your so what? What about this? Where do you want to go with that? And that's the larger quality piece for me. Are your peers out there from the Harvards and Yales and Caltechs and University of Chicago or wherever you happen to live, are they going to see this as being a real contribution in your field? And as I look back over the many learners I've worked with over time, mostly not in hard science because we don't have that many, there is a real attempt by the time a program is finished to make a contribution that's going to make a difference. And that's pretty much where we're aiming towards.
Jean, you bring a rich background in adult learning and educational psychology to this, and part of the psychology of tension that I often see in the learners, because they're paying tuition, because they're anxious to get done, because they want to get on with their lives, is a beginning to question, is going for quality worthwhile? What's the cost benefit of quality, of trying to do rigor, as opposed to just getting a sucker done and getting out of here? Now, you see learners over time, what it's like down the road. Is it worth going to the next notch? Is it worth aiming for the next level, or do you just get your resume padded and get out of here?
I tell all my learners, if they go slower, they'll go faster. Because they're not going to get through the checkpoints in the union with sloppy or insufficient research in their area. So I encourage them to go slower, go deeper, go more thoughtfully, and they will get out faster. And hopefully when they get out, I also tell them, you want to be proud of this degree and know that you are a match for anybody else in the field. When you go to present at a conference, which I hope you do, and I believe you will if you're not already doing it, that you won't feel ashamed of your degree or feel or have a lack of confidence that you know less than anybody else. You want to go there knowing that you've got it covered, that you've covered your field, you know what you're talking about, and hopefully even sometimes know how to make those presentations and answer those difficult questions because you've had an opportunity to practice it here. Again, practice. And so in their peer days, I encourage them to make a presentation in your peer day as a way of documenting what you've learned. present it to your peers. The peers here are the hardest critics of anyone, and they usually have peers in their field or sometimes out of their field that will ask the most difficult, which are usually the naive questions. So they can start practicing here in the union, making presentations to other professionals so that they can do this when they step out of here and they have their PhD. Does that answer your question?
It does, very nicely. And it leads me to invite you to comment as well, Peter, on quality peer days. I've heard you advocate over the years for peer days being a serious part of the program. It's one of the areas that learners sometimes write off as just a place to sort of punch the card and not treat it very seriously. What's your sense of what's a quality peer day and why it's worth learners taking the time to do a quality peer day?
That's a real good question, because many learners do take a check-off mentality, and I cannot advocate more strongly against that. Peer days are really opportunities to explore other avenues, other dimensions, to work with a bunch of experts, your peers, experts in different fields perhaps, or even in the same area or different aspects of it. And we sometimes forget that with our mature audience, everyone out there has expertise and experience that frequently we as faculty do not. And when you experienced folks out there start talking with one another, there is much that comes from that. So to waste that kind of a residency day rather than taking advantage of it is, in my mind, awful. I remember 15 years ago, perhaps someone who did all 10 peer days, was not a learner of mine, doing the learning agreement. Well, there's not very much learning that happens from that. To do a peer day properly, in my opinion, it means having a bibliography, doing the readings, preparing. You like to see presentations being made, Gene. I agree with you. It's good. Everyone in a peer day should make some kind of a presentation, whether it's formal or informal, a PowerPoint, or just be prepared to talk about some readings that everyone else has seen, or different readings if everyone is bringing a different source or resource into the peer day. And then, Michael, to pull those together in a way that does what the entire program should do, to synthesize what grows out of that, so that the peer day report truly is something that is creditable at the end. You should gain something out of a peer day. Now, having said that, peer days are learner days. They're not our days as faculty, and many learners need some kind of support along the way. And one of the things that happens with a check-off mentality, if you will, is that folks who do that try to get all 10 peer days done out of the way very early on in the program. And what a resource is wasted to later learners who come into the system. I would like to see my learners holding off a peer day or 2 or even 3 until very near the end of their programs. They're able to give something back. And that is, in my view, pretty much of a reflection of what our program is all about when we talk about social meaning. It's the giving back out. It's the scholarly input, and it's the impact. It is changing something out there. And if that doesn't happen during a peer day, why bother? Why bother?
Jean, any last thoughts you'd say to learners how to make this a high-quality experience for them?
Oh, I tell them to go with their passion, meaning to go with what you really love. And what I find that learners do is they do what they think they're supposed to do, or they try to write in a way they think they're supposed to write as a scholar, and then they have big trouble. I tell them to go with their passion, and we will work on the writing. We'll get that done, but go with your passion. Go with what you really want to learn about. Go with how you see yourself after you graduate as a person very knowledgeable in this field, in this area, as a college professor. Go with that. Keep that image in your head and work towards it.
It's a great way to end it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So let me recap the perspectives that you've been hearing through this videotape. We began with Ben Davis describing to you the faculty's quality assurance process the extensive review of documents that the Faculty Committee on Quality Assurance over the years has engaged in reviewing. And he reported that we have outstanding programs, learner PDEs and documents of the kind that you heard Peter Finner talk about, that are equivalent to the most prestigious universities in the country. And he also shared that there were documents that faculty identified that were unacceptable. And we talked about working around creating a process that helps support learners achieving the most that they can achieve in their union program, and having more and more of those learner programs that reflect that highest caliber and quality, and fewer that people have questions about. Mary Sheeran then described to you the discussions that occurred at the faculty retreat, in which they talked about enhancing quality, and her own perspective, emphasizing especially that quality constitutes a deep engagement with different perspectives, with historical and classical literature as well as recent literature, with multiple views, engagement of one's own perspective, but in dialogue with other and multiple perspectives, so that you're not only centered on your own experience, but also at the other extreme, not also only centered outside your own experience. What comes through in both of those, and in the subsequent discussions with Nancy Boxill, Alan Barstow, Jean Griffin, and Peter Finner, is that quality is not a thing. It's not a place that you get to, but it's an engagement, often that involves tensions between getting through and bringing rigor to bear in a way that may, in the short term, slow you down, but offer you a greater quality product over the long term. Ben Davis began with the distinction between quality control and quality enhancement. The whole quality assurance effort has these tensions in it between the control side, which is meeting minimum standards, and the enhancement side, which is supporting you as learners to accomplish the most that you can accomplish out of your own passions, and in dialogue with the community and your committee's sense of quality standards, of contribution to the field, of contribution to society, of connecting theory and practice, of engaging interdisciplinary perspectives and enriching your own understanding of the world and the things that you're passionate about through that. The tension between moving through quickly and doing high quality work, the tension between paying tuition and spending longer to do it better, the tension between treating the committee as a rubber stamp at pre-certification and pre-graduation meetings, and opening up the committee process to a deep dialogue where everybody feels that they're making a contribution to a quality product. These are the tensions that we live with in the union program. And what we hope this videotape invites you to do as you think about it and work with each other around it is to engage yourself in the questions of, what do you mean by quality? How do you engage this process in a way that, as Jean said, you feel good about it, not only getting through it, but a year and 2 years and 5 years down the line, that you know you've done quality work, that you know that you've made a contribution. Ultimately, that resides in your commitment and in that shared commitment that you engage with the committee that you've put together to address issues of excellence, of quality, to manage these very real tensions that are inherent in this program, that you've heard faculty say, we don't have a clear, specific definition of universal quality and don't want one, because part of what's alive for us as a faculty in this process is the ongoing engagement with the question. In other words, quality is not an answer, it's not a place. It is, in fact, an ongoing commitment, an ongoing engagement, a questioning process, a deepening process, one that begins and ends with your own commitment to your learning during union and to lifelong learning. We want to invite you as a part of this process to engage each other with your own experience of these tensions and with your own definitions of, when you look at union work, when you look at your own work, when you look at peer days, when you look at seminars, when you look at PDEs, when you serve on each other's committees, what do you look for? How do you distinguish outstanding work from less outstanding work? What standards do you bring for yourself and for others? And how do you dialogue about those things?